Thank you for joining us on our last event this week in collaboration with AUBG Daily and the AUBG Business Club. We have Professor Michael Cohen, who is going to give us more insight into expressing yourself publicly, controlling your body language, and successfully conveying your message. For those of you who still haven't met Professor Cohen, he is a Brown University graduate who has been teaching in AUBG for more than 15 years as part of the literature department. He has published several fictional stories and plays, and his novel, The Eyes, is an award-winning one. During the talk, if you guys have any questions, please write them in the chat or use the option to raise your hand as to not disrupt the flow of the topic. And at the end of this event, if time allows it, we will dedicate it to any questions left afterwards. I wish you all a pleasant experience, and Professor Cohen, now I will let you take over.
Okay, thank you for the nice introduction. So I want to begin with a story. I want to tell you about a student that I had. This was a student a couple years ago in public speaking. They were an excellent student. I'd had them before in a few classes. The student was an overachiever. All the assignments they did showed extra effort, total dedication. And they were the same in public speaking. So they approached their first speech, the informative speech, with a lot of dedication. They spent enormous amount of time honing the language, perfecting the structure. They rehearsed the speech over and over and over. They watched themselves on videotape. They practiced in front of family. They practiced in front of friends. They basically had the speech down perfectly. Then came the day of the speech. They waited until a few other students went because they were third. Their time came for the speech. They walked to the front of the class, and as I watched them walk to the front, I felt as though I was watching somebody walk to the gallows. I could see their shoulders sort of shrink under the weight, the pressure of the speech. They arrived in the front of the classroom. They turned to face the audience, and I could see their eyes sort of glaze over as they gazed out over the sea of all these faces, turning up to them with the expectation of them to begin their speech. I could see their palms were sweating, almost like they're melting. Their legs were actually visibly trembling. And it looked as though their heart was beating like it was a rat inside a cage. They opened their mouth, and then they dropped dead on the spot. I didn't say it was going to be a true story. So what I wanted to do there, this is a hook. I wanted to grab your attention immediately. And I want to tell you, just to relax any sort of fears you might have, that as far as I know, at least in my classes, nobody has ever dropped dead from public speaking. And as far as I know, nobody in the world has dropped dead from public speaking, maybe only from an assassin's bullet, right? So at least you probably will not die, though you might feel like it when you're giving a speech. Hopefully some of the things that I'm going to give you today will help relax you, so you're not going to have that feeling as though your heart's going to explode in your chest and you're going to drop dead. But first, I want to begin with a disclaimer. This is not a TED Talk, okay? So it's not going to have super sexy slides. I'm not especially good at those. It's not going to have amazing videos, and it's not going to be 18 minutes. It's actually going to be 3 times as long, okay? The other thing I want to tell you is that this is going to be an overload of information. You can think of it a little bit like the Matrix, where you're sort of getting a spike into the back of your head, right into that porthole, and you're going to be flooded with all this information about how to give a speech. Ideally, the things that are going to be useful to you are going to stick, and maybe the rest of the things will wash away. And my understanding too is that this is going to be recorded, so you can watch it again and again and again. Hopefully it'll be that good. So the other thing I want to tell you too is that this is not a substitute, of course, for actually doing public speaking. It's like you cannot learn how to drive a car or fly a plane with somebody actually telling you how to do it. It's an experiential thing. So that's why in my public speaking class, of course, students actually have to get in front of the class and give speeches. That's the only way you're going to learn it, is to put yourself into that spot, right? Where you feel sort of unsteady and so on. So as she said, I'm going to take questions at the end. The other thing I want you to sort of plant in your mind is that here and there, I'll ask for some participation from people. We'll see how that works. We have 82 participants. Woo! That's almost as many as Joe Rogan has, right? Pretty close. So yeah, when I ask for participants, maybe a few of you will step forward. I can't exactly see them. We have so many people that it's not going to be possible to have that many participants, but I think we can get a few of them in there. So let's begin. All right, this is what we're going to cover. This is what's called a preview, if you didn't know. And the reason you want to preview, of course, your speech, give an idea of what you're going to talk about, is that unlike in an article or in a book, in a speech, you cannot go back, right? So basically what a preview does is it kind of prepares the audience for the speech. It gives them a few ideas of what's to follow so they can kind of set their mind. And that way, when these items come later, they're prepared for them. It makes the information much easier to retain. So the first thing, we'll talk about where the fear comes from and how to deal with it, which is probably why most of you are here, I imagine. A little thumbnail of theory, okay? It's a little bit dry, but actually I think speech communication theory is really useful for giving a speech, understanding the speech communication model, among other things. Delivery, of course, how you deliver your message, because it's not really just about what you say, it's how you use your body, it's how you use your voice, right, to get it across, how you stand. Structure, we'll talk about that a little bit. And warm-ups. Yeah, I'm actually going to get out of my chair, move a little bit, and maybe at some point I will ask you guys to do the same. And finally, we'll talk about being in the moment of the speech. And the reason I want to do this is because what I've discovered is that mostly when I give speeches in class, because I've been teaching public speaking for over a decade, I can tell from the students' reaction that most of them, they cannot wait for their speech to be over. And this is not the way you should approach the speech. You really should embrace that moment. You wanna be absolutely present when you do it. All right, so where the fear comes from. Let's try a little participation. So anybody of you 83, anybody have any ideas? Let's see how this works. Any thoughts?
Maybe it's the fear of embarrassing yourself.
Ooh, very good. Okay, yeah. Absolutely.
Doubting ourselves too.
Okay, for sure, yeah. This you know, we're forced to kind of face our fears, our anxieties. We're afraid of being embarrassed. We doubt our skills.
Professor?
Mm-hmm.
Is the fear that we aren't unsure and we are going to be humiliated by the class, because it happened to me in high school, the same thing when I was giving a speech.
Okay, yeah. It's an awful experience, but an edifying one, I think. Okay.
Maybe also the fear of rejection, Professor.
Yeah, nobody likes to be rejected. It happened to me, so back in high school. Oh, it's still
Michael. Hi, Michael. I think this is kind of cheating since I was in class, so I know. It's kind of, we feel attacked because it's a primal fear that our territory has been damaged. And
very good. Exactly. See, I have many former students in here too, so they know these things. Exactly. So, and I recognize that voice, and I would expect that you're cheating. Now, it's not cheating. It's just showing knowledge. All right. Well, you guys stole a lot of my thunder, but I'll go through those points. The first, and obviously the clearest one, right, is that we're terrified of failure and embarrassment. This is usually what we imagine. When we imagine the speech, we think about everything that can go wrong, right? And we imagine that we're just going to absolutely, you know, make a total a travesty on stage. You know, that we're going to embarrass ourselves. It's going to be something that people are talking about for ages, right? We tend to have this kind of negative programming, and that's something that I'll talk about later. Another thing is this: perfectionism. okay? Perfectionism is really like a double-edged sword. Obviously, it's a good trait to have because we want to strive to be perfect. But at the same time, there's no such thing as a perfect speech, right? So what you have to recognize when you're preparing for a speech and when you're giving a speech is that you're going to fumble, right? You're going to trip over words. You may forget what you're saying in some spot because you're a human being. And when people are watching that speech, they do not expect you to be perfect, okay? We're not, what I tell my students in public speaking class is, I'm not training you to be a public speaking robot, but actually to kind of find your strengths and your weaknesses. So you do not have to be perfect. A perfect speech is virtually impossible. And actually, if you watch TED Talks, you'll see this too. You'll see these great speakers, people who are professionals, maybe they've given the speech, 50 times, 100 times, they still fumble, but we don't really focus on that. Those things are much more amplified in our head. This is very similar to what somebody said. Part of the thing that makes, that gives us this kind of speech anxiety is this uncertainty, this loss of control, right? When we're up in front of a room, we don't have control over all the events. We have control over what we do, right? But there's this uncertainty that, maybe we'll forget, maybe we'll fumble, maybe our tech isn't going to work out, maybe people are not going to be interested, okay? And I'll talk about that a little bit too. Part of it is really surrendering that control. You can't guarantee that everyone's going to be interested, and it shouldn't matter to your speech. And finally, as the student who cheated stole my thunder, biology. The thing about this is that we are hardwired to feel afraid in that spot, okay? A lot of students who take the class, the public speaking class, I think they have this notion that there's going to be this kind of magical formula, right? Or this sort of technique that I'm going to give them. And then boom, they're no longer going to be afraid when they give a speech. But it doesn't work that way, okay? You can never totally outdistance the fear because it's hardwired in our body. It's a primal fear, all right? It goes all the way back to caveman times, basically, right? So this situation where you're alone and you're standing in front of a group of predators, if you will, basically this sea of eyes, they're all focused on you and you're unarmed, and it feels like a position where you really, you're at a disadvantage, right? You feel vulnerable. So what can we do about it? All right, well, here are a few things, okay? Recognize that it's universal. And this, I think, for a lot of students, when they realize this, when, I tell them stories about Laurence Olivier, who was probably one of the greatest Shakespearean actors of all time. Supposedly, every time Laurence Olivier, before he went on stage, he would actually throw up, right? And again, I mean, this guy's been on stage probably thousands of times in his life. So recognizing that it's not unique to you, I think makes students feel a little bit better. Use it. When you have this fear, actually this fear gives you a kind of focus when you learn how to use it. And the nervousness that you feel, this nervousness actually gives you a kind of energy. One of the things that I tell students is, back in the day, I used to do theater, and before a performance, I would be backstage, and just like you guys, I'd be nervous, right? My palms are sweating, my legs are a little bit shaky, I have that kind of like, butterfly feeling in the stomach. But the moment I hit the stage and the moment I started speaking, I would forget about the nervousness. And actually the nervousness would be translated into energy. The nights when I didn't feel nervous, what I discovered is that actually my performance was like a little bit flat. It was a little bit off. So actually the nervousness is really a good thing. It's just a matter of not letting the nervousness and the fear take you over and using it. You can rename it. What they've discovered in studies is actually just this simple exercise of what they call reframing. Instead of saying, oh my God, I'm so nervous about this speech, I can't do it, and saying, I'm excited about this speech, calling it something different can actually completely transform your attitude, all right? So that's something you should do in a speech. Don't go into it focused on this nervousness, but tell yourself that that nervousness is actually excitement. because the feeling is virtually the same, right? So that's another way of using it. This is one of my favorites, very sage wisdom, which I received from a guru, which existed inside a yogi tea bag. If you know these yogi tea bags, they have these little sayings, and I love this one. This is basically Buddhism in a nutshell. And the idea is that it's not about you, okay? It's not about, you know, do I look cool? How do I sound? All this kind of thing. One of the things that I'm going to tell you repeatedly is that you have to kind of forget yourself. So no ego, no problems. And finally, this, the spotlight effect. What the spotlight effect is everybody has this feeling when they're on stage that they're in a spotlight and they're completely transparent, right? So when their heart is pounding in their chest, like that student I made up, they feel like people can see it, right? They can see how nervous they are. They can hear how dry their mouth is. They can, you know, see all that kind of trembling that student is doing. But it's not true. And I've seen this time and time again in a class where after a student will give a speech, right? And people will say, wow, you were really relaxed. You know, that was a really great speech, quite smooth. And the student will say, oh my God, I was crapping my pants. So the truth of the matter is that people can't see it. They can't see your heart beat in the chest. They can't know the level of nervousness. And once people realize that this spotlight effect is actually kind of a myth, they feel much more relaxed. The metaphor that I use too is think of yourself a little bit like a duck on the water. And the duck, as it's gliding on the water, very smooth, very graceful, right? But underneath the water, it's paddling, paddling, paddling. So mostly your nervousness is invisible. Finally, fake it until you become it. I had a student in class, a real student, not an imaginary one, who died on stage. And one of the things they said to me, they approached me after class, maybe a day or two before they had to give their speech, excuse me, and they said, I don't think I can do it. They said, I have no confidence when I get on stage. What do I do? And I said, you fake it, right? Just like in any other area of your life where you start out and you really don't know exactly what you're doing, you fake it. I think a lot of you probably had this experience in work and travel, right? The first day you show up at the job and everybody's just kind of moving around. They know exactly what you're doing. And you're the idiot who doesn't know anything. But you just kind of jump in. You jump in and you fake it until you make it. And even further, you fake it until you become it. And this I borrowed from, I cannot remember her name, but she's a woman who has a TED Talk. And she talks about that. Through this repetition, right? You're faking it, you're faking it, you're faking it. And eventually, before you know it, you become that person, okay? All right, a thumbnail of theory. This is a little bit dry, but like I said, I think it's really important. When I was an undergraduate, one of the classes, everybody had to take public speaking. And I still remember the teacher. She was marvelous because she was also a theater director. She would give us a whole unit on speech communication theory. And actually learning some of these things completely reframed the way that I thought about public speaking, okay? I think most people think about public speaking as something very unique, this kind of isolated incident that they're completely unprepared for because they never do it in real life. But as I say here, this is something we practice all the time. So we spend probably 30% of our day in conversation. I think, or at least we used to, right? Face-to-face conversation. This is public speaking. So you've been practicing these goals basically since you could talk, even before you were verbal, right? You were still trying to kind of express yourself with sounds. And you're doing actually all the same things that somebody does in a speech or a presentation, right? You're trying to entertain, persuade, or inform, or maybe all three at the same time. So let me talk a little bit about the similarities, the things that are exactly the same in conversation as they are in doing public speaking. So obviously you're trying to organize your thoughts logically. If you didn't, you know, if you're just kind of speaking like blah, 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 random, you know, nonsense, where there was no sort of clear syntax or grammar to your thoughts, you wouldn't make sense. This is something you do just basically without thinking. The other thing that you do without thinking, and you do this in a speech too, is you tailor your message to your audience, right? Most of us anyway, we don't speak exactly the same to our best friend as we do to our mother, to our grandmother, or the police officer who pulls us over because we got a speeding ticket, right? This is what you do in a speech too. This is really the heart of rhetoric. You're constantly tailoring your message so that it suits your audience. So this should be quite familiar. You also tell a story for maximum impact, right? You're always thinking, or at least most of my friends are, and myself, when you tell a story, you want it to be interesting. You want to engage an audience. So you're thinking about the order of the story, right? You're choosing your details in a particular way. You're structuring the events in a particular way so there's a kind of a narrative tension, and you're probably building towards some sort of climax, or at least some kind of conclusive point in an argument. And it's the same in a speech. And you adapt to listener feedback, right? If you're talking to a friend, and I'm sure this is a very familiar situation to most of you now, and they're just kind of like doom scrolling on their phone. This is the thing that drives me crazy. You're going to adapt your message to that, right? Maybe you're going to pick up the rate of speech. Maybe you're going to increase your volume. Maybe you'll tell them to put the damn phone down, whatever it happens to be, right? But based on that feedback, you're going to change your message. And that's what people do during a speech too. Of course, one of the challenges that we have, that we're in this situation now, which is basically new to all of us, is it's much harder to get the feedback from the audience, right? Like, for example, right now, I'm looking at my PowerPoint presentation. I can't adapt to your feedback because I can't see you. So I don't know what you're doing, right? I don't know if you're paying attention. I don't know if you're, watching a YouTube video. Maybe you're making a sandwich. Maybe some of you are asleep. But in class, when I'm talking, or if I'm giving a speech in public, I can adapt to that feedback. Again, I can increase my volume. I can maybe make a kind of emphatic pause that's going to force the students to kind of, what's going on, and pay attention. So those are all the things that are similar. These are the things that we do all the time since we've had the ability to converse with people. Here are a few things that are different, and I think these are really obvious, right? But again, I think it's useful to think about just so you realize that public speaking is something that you already have within you. It's not an alien activity that you have to start from scratch at. Obviously, public speaking is more structured, right? Depending on whether you're giving an informative speech or persuasive speech or a demonstration speech, you structure your speech in a particular way, okay? So that your message is clear. I'll talk a little bit about structure later on, right? You have an introduction, you have a body, you have a conclusion that finishes with this kind of finale. And for the most part, people don't do that in regular conversation, right? Although I have to say that actually I did have a friend who was so nervous when he went on dates that he would actually prepare notes. And if the date was not going well and the conversation was not flowing, then he would disappear into the bathroom and check his notes. He's like, maybe this will get things rolling. But by and large, for most of us, it's much more spontaneous in regular conversation than in a speech. So a speech might be conversational in tone, and I think arguably it should be. I think that there was a time when public speaking was a little bit more formalized. TED Talks have had a dramatic impact on how speeches work. I think they tend to be much more conversational, much more kind of the tone of a story told across the fire, right? But obviously, even though it's conversational, it's more planned, and usually there is a time limit. So in regular conversation, you can sit over a bottle of wine, you could talk to your friend all night long. A speech is not going to go all night long. You hope this presentation is not going to go all night long. We'll see. Generally, of course, more formal language, though again, it's conversational. You'd be less likely to use jargon. You'd be less likely to swear in a speech too, right? Depending on your audience, and largely because these things are kind of credibility killers, right? Nobody's going to take you as seriously if your language is a little bit too informal. But again, it depends on the context and the audience. And of course, speaker listener roles are more defined, right? Now I'm talking at you and I'm not asking for participation. So I basically run the show. Obviously in conversation, it's a little bit more of a give and a take. Ideally, we're passing the ball back and forth. Although of course, all of us have those friends who never shut up. So as far as they're concerned, they're the speaker and you're the listener. But generally, it's a little bit more of a two-way street. All right, a little bit more theory. I promise this is the last slide of theory, but as I said, I think it's useful. So this is really sort of the backbone of the speech communication. This is the speech communication model, and it has 7 parts. These are all the aspects that come into play when you're giving a speech. And again, this is a really, really general outline. If this is something that interests you, then I encourage you to do a little bit more research. I mean, it's a whole field of study. You can go out and get a PhD in it if you want. So the first thing, obviously, you have the speaker or the speakers. In this case, that's me, right? You have the listener or the listeners, including their frame of reference. Now, frame of reference is something that's a little bit more complicated, but it's useful to think about when you give a speech. Basically, frame of reference is everything that makes up that person's frame of reference for the world. So their socioeconomic background, their cultural beliefs, you know, their education, et cetera, et cetera. So all these things that kind of filter the information as it's coming to you. The more you know about that as a speaker, obviously the more you can tailor your message so that you can kind of, you know, match their frame of reference. And this is something good politicians, not bad politicians, will do. You know, if a politician goes out campaigning, they're going to probably talk to a group of, you know, people who are in the AMA, right? Doctors and so on, differently than they will a group of coal miners, right? Because they have a different frame of reference, different values, different desires. The message. This arguably is the most important part of the speech. And this is the thing that actually people tend to forget, okay? This is really what you're trying to deliver. And students, at least, get so caught up in kind of like, what am I doing with my body? You know, that guy in the front row, he doesn't seem particularly interested. They forget about their message. What's your goal? What are you trying to get across in your message? Why are you actually there standing in front of that group? And what are you saying with words? And what are you saying with your body? And the body is something you really have to work on. Now we're all sort of like centaurs, right? We're like modern centaurs. We're sort of half people, half chairs, right? So it's a little bit more difficult. Basically, we have, I'll talk about this more later, but we have our hands and we have our facial expressions, okay? What they say that 2/3 of the message that comes across to the audience is actually delivered with your body. And you know this is true, right? Because if I'm delivering like this, you know, just talking to you kind of like this, doesn't really come across very powerful. I'm not particularly engaged, so why should you be? Or of course, if I deliver my message like this, right? That also doesn't really communicate as though I'm interested. I'm interfering with my message with my body. So something else to think about. The channel. Usually what the channel is just your voice going out into the audience. And maybe it's an amplified voice. If you're in a big auditorium, right, you might have a microphone. In this case, the channel, of course, is the computer. So I'll talk a little bit more about that online. I'm still learning, just like the rest of you. But obviously, one of the things that I've realized is that just like in a regular speech, it's important that I look at you. That's why I'm looking directly in the camera. And I've noticed having a lot of online meetings, more than I ever thought I would have in my life, a lot of people don't do this. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect, I think, in the channel. Feedback. This is hugely important. But again, because we're online, we don't have that as much. So feedback is, you have to think of speech communication as kind of a loop. You have the speaker, and then you have the feedback that's coming from the audience, and it's going back to the speaker. And what a good speaker does is they pay attention to the feedback and they adapt their message to that. Again, it's more difficult online. This is one of the huge struggles that we're all dealing with, especially us teachers too. In a regular classroom, I feel like one of my sort of skills as a teacher is I've kind of developed this sort of antennae to student feedback. And I feel like if I'm losing the class and that's the feedback that's coming, I'm going to adapt my message. As I said before, I'm going to maybe increase my rate of speech. I'm going to put a little bit more energy in my voice, right? Or again, maybe I'll pause. Online, it's a little bit more difficult if you can't see people. And of course, you don't know exactly what people are doing. The environments. This is a big part of a speech too, right? Is the room where you're actually giving the speech, you know, paying attention to how big it is, how you adjust your voice, how you take into account all these different members of the audience. So one of the things that I tell my students is that if you're giving a speech in public, the first thing that you should do right before you're giving your speech, get there early and check out the room. Get up on the stage, see how it feels, right? You know, look out over the room so you don't have that first moment like in my scenario in the beginning where you turn and face the audience and you're just kind of frozen like a deer in the headlights. You have to really become comfortable in the environment and maybe say a few words so you know exactly how you sound, so you know how it feels there. The last one for the speech communication model, interference. And these are all the things that kind of interfere with the moment of your speech. I generally teach in the old building at the American University, and I've heard a lot of people kind of, you know, disparage on it. It's the old former Communist Party headquarters. It's kind of fallen apart. It's ugly. I have to say, I actually love the old building. I don't know what it is. Maybe I just like old things as I get older, but I feel really at home there too. That being said, very often there's interference when I'm teaching a class, and that interference comes sometimes in very obvious forms, right? Could be somebody drilling upstairs. They're constantly doing remodeling because things are falling apart. Could be Nadalko Delchev's class, because usually my public speaking class is in close proximity to his theater class. So often I will hear Nadalko or other students shouting, right? Could be the cars outside. Maybe a car alarm goes off. So what you have to think about as a public speaker is how you adapt to that interference. The psychological interference, there's only so much you can do about, but having an understanding of the things that distract audience members, what that psychological interference is. And again, it has to do with the frame of reference often, you know, where people kind of seize up. If you're talking about certain issues, you can work around that. So that's the theory. That's a really cursory, reductive approach to speech communication theory. I encourage you to delve a little bit deeper. But now let's get on to something a little bit more concrete, which is delivery. And I have to say, in all honesty, when I made this is an older PowerPoint presentation. I beefed it up a little bit for you guys. But Rudy Giuliani was not really much of a character on the scene. I just found the picture funny, and I find him actually a pretty absurd character, as do most of the late night comedians. It's kind of hard to believe that he was actually the mayor of New York at one time and taken seriously by people. But I think he was a relatively good public speaker. He sort of distinguished himself in the time of, you know, September 11th. Now he's just a ridiculous public speaker. This other guy here, well, it's a different kind of delivery, which might be called for it sometimes. Not that I'm advocating revolution, but, you know, maybe Rudy Giuliani could use a Molotov cocktail since he likes to drink. All right, so these are the things I'm going to talk about with delivery in brief: body, voice, and very briefly about eye contact. Okay, so body. Everybody, as far as I know, you have a body. We don't have as much with the online speaking, but you still have the body that you move in. This is the main thing that people focus on stage, right? Is your body. It's a big part of where your message comes from. So posture and stance. I'm going to move my chair. It's really important when you're given a speech that you actually stand up straight. And I think what's happening with most of the world, especially the younger generation, sorry to points, but is that people are kind of de-evolving, right? We're sort of like that chart where they show the evolution, and we start out like this and then we become upright. And now we're slowly moving this way because of all the devices. So it's really important that you stand up straight. And what I tell my students is that the way to find that posture, so pardon my exposed belly, this is supposed to be PG. You raise your hands over your head and then you let them drop, relaxed at your side. And that's the posture. And the good posture is important too, because what it communicates is confidence when you speak, right? There's a huge difference between this posture and this posture, right? Or this kind of posture. Being open, right? And standing up erect. Hands and gestures, use them. The studies that they've done have shown that actually the hands reinforce the message significantly. And again, because we're cut off, you know, all we have is this when we're online, it's important that somehow you try and use your hands. I know for me that I can't talk without my hands. I know a few other professors like this too, right? And one other little point about hands, when you talk, it's much better to have an open palm. And you'll see this. You'll see this is what good politicians will do. Even Donald Trump, right? Even Trump, who they have all these memes of him basically playing the invisible accordion. Probably at some point he had a handler who told him that, Donald, it's important that you speak with these open hands. And this invites the audience in. And I think also on an unconscious level too, it makes people feel that they can trust you. It's probably something else that goes back to this primal idea that, you know, when people have closed hands, maybe they're holding a weapon in them. But there's a big difference between this, and of course this, right? The last thing you want to do is point at people. So yeah, using your hands to express your message and also keeping them open palmed. And if you don't know what to do with them most of the time, you can, you know, kind of keep them at your center, right? And then occasionally gesture. But that's something I really encourage students to play with. And it's a good reason to watch yourself on video too. Breathing. I highly recommend that you do it. It's important that you breathe, okay? Your voice comes from breath. These are where the sounds come from. But even more importantly than that, when people are panicked, they tend to breathe very shallowly. I heard a story of a student, this is a true story, not another lie, who in a colleague's class at AUBG basically was very, very nervous before a speech and warned the professor, but he kind of pushed her up on stage because that's what we do, right? There's always that anxiety. They got up on stage and they started kind of, and then boom, they passed out. This is what happens. It's the fight and flight response. If you don't slow down and take a breath, right? Sometimes you can feel very lightheaded. You can hyperventilate on stage. So it's important to just pause once in a while, take a deep breath, and continue. And I've had students who feel self-conscious about it, but what I tell them is nobody's going to look at you and say like, well, man, they were breathing. It's just a normal thing. So people, what I've discovered is that people who actually have training in singing, they breathe much more naturally. I've had a few students too where we do critiques after the speech and I tell them actually you breathe really well. So it's important. Take those deep breaths. And even when you begin your presentation too, just take that deep breath to kind of center yourself. Moving versus standing still. Again, we really don't have much option because we're online. But when we get offline and you're doing a presentation, this is something I encourage you to play with. You know, you have to kind of figure out, it depends on the stage, of course, you know, how much room you have, whether you're on camera, but you have to figure out what kind of speaker you are. There are professors who basically are rooted in a spot, right? And then there are professors and public speakers who are constantly moving. And this is something that can also reinforce your message. If you watch a really good TED Talk, what you'll see is that they're moving in such a way that it reinforces their story. They may be talking, and then they fix in a spot to kind of make their point. When it comes to being online, what I'll tell you is this. It's important, again, that you have this posture, that you're squared to your camera. And in terms of movements, okay, yeah, the hands, the face, the head, but the one thing that you can't do, and I've watched a lot of people speak online since this all began, and students do this, you know, not just students, teachers too. completely unconsciously, we all have these fancy kind of chairs, or most of us, is they start to kind of swing, right? And sway, and they're not even realizing it. And obviously this is very distracting. And what this does too, is this indicates that you have a certain kind of nervousness, right? So, you know, be sure not to swing your chair too much. The other thing, and this is obviously being online makes this effortless, is you have to face the audience. When you're not online, when you're actually in a room, often what happens, most of us use PowerPoint now, is people will basically give the audience their back, right? And they'll be focused on the screen. And in all honesty, I have been guilty of this myself. So what I tell students, it's important that you do what they call in theater, cheating out. So if you have to face back to point to something, your body is still open to the audience like this, right? So those are the main things with the body. Just a couple of other things that I noticed that crop up, and some of you may have this too, is that, like I said, often this is kind of a base position, which we really call basically the prayer position. And sometimes what students will do is, I've invented names for this. And they're trademarked, so don't steal them. Is what's called the tortured hand syndrome. Some of my students who are out there, they know this one, right? Where basically their hands are locked in, but they're like punishing themselves. It's this kind of self-harm. And this is where their nervousness is manifest. One thing that somebody suggested to me, I've never tried this, but some of you might, is that if you have tension in your body and you don't quite know what to do with it, you can actually curl your toes in your shoes, because this is a spot nobody can see it. So that's a place where you can manifest it. Up above, you're very calm, but in your shoes, you're a little bit like that duck, you know, kind of curling the toes. All right, that's it for body. There's obviously much, much more for all of these things, but that's your introduction. The voice, volume. So obviously volume is an issue for some people in terms of how loud to be. You know, some people don't have enough power. That's something people have to work on individually. What I want to talk about is how you can use your voice in different ways, how you can use the volume. I have a really big voice, right? One of the first things I tell my students when I start the class is, it's going to seem like I'm screaming at you, but I'm not really. It's a big voice. I'm a little bit deaf in one ear from, you know, my punk rock days, so I can't really help it. But what I try and do, and what I encourage you to do, is to play with the volume of your voice. So if you have a big voice, or if you have a small voice that you have to kind of bring up and make bigger, you don't have to keep it up here all the time. That actually your voice can be made softer, right? You can vary the volume of your voice to reinforce your message. Remember, it's all about what you can do to get your message across. You can even bring it down to a whisper, if you can hear me. Your rate of speech. This is something else you can play with. And I won't ask you, but I'm sure you know, the default rate of speech for most student speeches is way too fast, because they're very nervous and they don't even realize that they're speaking too fast. It's okay to speak fast sometimes, right? But this is something you should play with. Vary your rate of speech. Sometimes you want to slow down to emphasize points. So it's another tool that you can play with. Articulation. Most of the students, virtually all of the students that I teach at American University, of course, are English as a second language. So sometimes articulation becomes an issue. And what I tell them is that it's very important to over-articulate, especially if you have a really heavy accent. And the place you can learn this actually is from watching BBC, because this is how all these posh journalists speak. Right? It tends to be a very forward placement, and they tend to really enunciate the ends of the words. So, vocal variety, playing with the range of your voice. Now, I think this tends to be something that men struggle with actually a little bit more than women. And partially, I think it's enculturated, at least in Bulgaria. What I always say is that most men feel like they really need to have this deep voice because it's manly. And young boys, even in an early age, before their, you know, testicles have even dropped, they just have this really deep voice. Yo, što praviš, you know, Christo, right? but actually it gets very dull, okay? Even if you have a beautiful voice like Barry White, I have a deep voice. Some people tell me it's beautiful, but I try to use more of my range, right? Try and use all your range. This is one other way to kind of play with your message. So if you have a deep voice, go high in spots, right? And if you have a high voice, try and get to the bottom of the range too, okay? Energy. One of the things that even if students are doing all these other things very well with their voice, sometimes their voice just has this kind of lifeless energy, right? Or lack of energy. This is something we've all experienced. All of us have sat through classes where basically the teacher, for whatever reason, maybe they're just past their prime, maybe they're exhausted with the topic, they're overworked, they're underpaid, their voice has no energy, no vocal variety. Listening to a monotone voice is deadening after a while. So you have to put energy in your voice. This is something I do naturally as a teacher. I don't even think about it anymore, right? And for you, people who maybe need to work on this issue, it's going to feel a little bit unnatural when you start to do it, but I'm telling you, it will not sound unnatural. So try and listen to yourself on tape and try and detect, do you have that energy? Do you have that kind of excitement? Because if you don't, if you're not excited about what you're saying, nobody's gonna care, right? Pauses. Pauses are the secret weapon in the arsenal of public speaking. I think very often when people give a speech or a presentation, they have this feeling like they're a DJ on the radio. And if they're silent for even a second, that this is basically going to be the equivalent of what they call in the radio dead air. And nothing is worse than dead air. But in fact, pauses are really important, okay? One thing they do, of course, is they allow the information to sink in. So it's important to pause after you make a really profound point. They also allow the audience a kind of a breather too, right? It could draw in the attention. And again, like I said, what I will often do in class is if I feel like the attention of the students is slipping, I'll just shut up. And everyone kind of, huh? What's going on? Why did he stop talking? So think about it like music. If music has no rests, it just becomes kind of noise after a while. There needs to be silence in there. The last thing about voice, filler, all these kind of so, like, okay? These are things you have to detect. These are things you have to work on, these kind of verbal tics. And yeah, I have my verbal tics too. For years, I would probably append man at the end of virtually every sentence. I call my wife man, my daughters man, and my students. So, but I've tried to work on it. These are very hard to eliminate though, especially the ums and the ers, and they're human. Like I said earlier on, there's no such thing as a perfect speech, but the more of these you can eliminate, the better. All right, it's participation time, a little bit. So what I need volunteers, okay? I need volunteers to read just one stanza. I will do the first one, and I want you to do it with as much vocal energy and vocal variety as they can muster. So I'll do the first one, and then hopefully somebody will step up for the others. There's only 6. Now, this is Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, right? The point is, there is really no point. There is a kind of a story, but I want you to be more focused on the energy and vocal variety in what you do than on the content. That's why I chose this. So here we go. 'Twas brillig again the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves, and the mome wraiths outgrabe. Can I have a volunteer?
Professor, me?
Yeah, go.
Okay. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jabs that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jabberbird, and shun the frumious Bandersnatch.
Excellent. Another
Thank
volunteer.
you.
Somebody out there in virtual land?
Me, Professor.
Do it.
He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the maxim foe he sought. So rested he by the tum-tum tree, and stood a while in thought.
Okay. Actually, there's 4 more. Another volunteer? I know there's a lot of you out there.
Can I?
Please do.
And as an offish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as it came.
I recognize that voice, even though I can't see you. All right. Another one.
Can I?
Yes, please.
1, 2, 1, 2, and through, the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head, he went galloping back.
Very good. And I need 2 more. Another one.
May I try?
Please be my guest.
And has thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my Beamish boy. Oh, Frabbis day, Calloo, Calais, he chortled in his joy.
Okay, and last one. Who wants to finish us off?
Can I?
Yes, you can. And you, please do.
'Twas brilling, and the slightly toves did gar and gimble in the wave. Oh, Mimsy where the borough goes, and the mom rests outraged. Sorry for the pronunciation.
Excellent. Very good, guys. So yeah, I mean, it's not that everything you're going to do is in a speech and so on is going to be poetry, but it should basically have that kind of energy and feeling too. All right, eye contact. I only have 1 slide on eye contact because there really isn't much to say about it. All right. It's one of the things I think that people struggle with the most when they're giving a speech. Okay. Obviously online it's very difficult, you know, when I've been playing with it, but I feel like it really makes a difference when I'm looking right at the camera, you know, because it's, you know, when you're looking at your screen, you see me essentially looking at you like Big Brother. What I tell my students in class is this, is that rather than trying to take in the whole room, which you can't, is that each person you're looking at, you think of it like a kind of an individual conversation, right? And this is, again, something that most of us do naturally, because in most cultures, if you don't make eye contact, it indicates a lack of confidence, or that maybe you're hiding something too. So that's what I tell students, to kind of look at one person at a time. You're talking to that person, then you're moving to another person, then another person. And this business of pouring a glass of wine, this is not my idea, but the idea is that that's how long as you shift eye contact, the length of time it takes to pour a glass of wine, I wish I had one right now, that's how long you hold the eye contact. It doesn't work for me. This is something I do naturally, but also for me, I find like, I think if I was looking at somebody and thinking like I'm also pouring a glass of wine and having to think about what I'm saying at the same time, it's gonna feel a little bit weird. It's gonna be too much, but you might try it. Okay, an introduction to structure. Wow, I'm taking longer. It's all my side stories, but you guys have nothing better to do. You're all trapped at home. So these are the aspects, and I'll move through this a little bit more quickly, only because, and it's very general, there's obviously much more to study in this, because it's quite familiar, I think, to most people, right? Most people have a clear understanding, at least of how an essay works, at least most students do, or believe they do. And this follows the same form, right? You have an introduction, you know, where you grab the attention and introduce the topic of your speech. You have the body, and then signpost. This is something I'll explain, which is a little bit different. And of course, finally, you have a conclusion, which winds it up. So the introduction. This arguably is the most important part of the speech. And the first thing that you need, of course, is a hook, right? You have to grab their attention. What I always say is that attention is the scarcest resource these days. People are so distracted. Everybody's warring for your attention all the time. So you have to come up with something that is really unusual and interesting, okay? But obviously related to the topic of your speech. Now this 7:30, this is a little bit discouraging. Basically what this means is they've done studies where they've monitored people's attentions for watching, you know, online speeches. And what they've discovered is that in the first 7 seconds, we decide whether we like this person or dislike this person. In the first 30 seconds, we decide if we're interested in this speech or not. And it seems like a little bit harsh, right? Probably actually too, there were some people here, you know, who don't know me at all. In the first 7 seconds, they were like, what's the story with this guy, man? You know, what's that thing? He's wearing a bandana. Is that like, is he in a hoodie? And he's supposed to be a professor? And then they maybe watched a little bit longer and either they were caught or they were not. If you think this is unrealistic though, think about how you go through TED Talks. This is how I realized this statistic is actually true. If you're looking for interesting speeches, as I do, you will watch about 7 seconds and you'll realize like, I don't really like this guy or this woman, right? But then you'll keep watching because you're a little bit curious about their message. It takes you about 30 seconds to decide if that message is something that pulls you in or not. The good news, I guess, is that they can not like you and still be interested in the message. And this is true. I watched a speech the other day from this woman who talks about the 5-second rule, and I don't like her. I realized in the first 7 seconds, I didn't like her style. I didn't like the way she talked. It's kind of a turnoff for a variety of reasons. But I found her message interesting enough that I actually watched the whole thing. So you got to hook them, right? The other thing you have to do, of course, in the beginning of a speech, you have to have a topic statement. You have to clearly state what your speech is about or your presentation. And I know this sounds very banal and unimportant, but you'd be amazed how many people don't do this. And what happens is if you don't clearly state what your topic is, people are kind of scrambling, trying to figure it out. You know, what are they talking about? What are they talking about? And at some point, they're going to lose interest. Another thing you have to do in the introduction is you have to show how it's relevant. Why should the audience care about your message? Okay, so in this speech, let's see, I had this kind of hook, this bogus story about a student who died. Maybe it happened somewhere, right? You knew I was going to talk about public speaking, but maybe I didn't talk about how it was relevant. If I was going to make this a little bit more like a speech, I probably would have said something about how communication is actually one of the most important skills. And this is borne out in studies too. When they basically conduct surveys with corporations, you know, businesses and so on, what are they looking for in their employees? You know, what are the most important things? Right towards the top is communication. Most of the jobs are going to be automated, right? But a job can't do this. A job can't give a computer can't give a presentation like a human can. So that would have been, I guess, my statement of relevancy, knowing my audience, since you're mostly students. Credibility. Why should we listen to you? So I didn't have a credibility statement, but I guess it kind of came in the introduction in some ways. Because I've been teaching this for a while, people assume I know what I'm talking about. And that's why, you know, they listen to me, or you should listen to me. When it comes to you guys, you know, especially if you're prospective students or you're still undergrads, maybe you don't have the same kind of credibility, but you can get it across in the beginning of your speech because you can talk about maybe you have a lifelong passion or interest in the subject, or maybe you just research the hell out of it, right? So you know exactly what you're talking about. Generally, the topics that my students are delivering in public speaking, I don't know that much about. So they establish their credibility pretty quickly, you know, through the research they've done. And then you have to have a preview. Actually, you don't have to. I did in this speech. I told you what I was going to talk about. I think, as I said before, it's the best way to kind of set the audience's mind for what those points are going to be. But if you watch a lot of TED Talks, they often don't preview. Okay, this is one of those things that maybe is a little bit gone out of fashion. I think it depends upon the context and how complicated your topic is. Salting. Sometimes people have salting and sometimes they don't. Okay, what salting is basically you're making a promise to the audience, a little bit like a salesperson, of what they're going to get out of the speech by the end. So often a salting statement is, by the end of the speech, you know, I'm going to teach you a fundamental trick that's going to change the way you perceive yourself. And people are kind of, ooh, right? So salting can be very effective. That's the introduction. The challenge with the introduction is that depending on the length of your speech, it has to do all these things in like a minute or a minute and a half. So it's probably the most important part of the speech, and it's the part that people struggle with the most. The body. My students love this slide. This is the epitome of true relaxation. This is the Shavasana posture, right? Which is the corpse posture in yoga. And she's so relaxed that she's elongated her body. It wasn't me. This is an untouched slide. All right, so you know the body. This is the heart of the speech, right? The body has to have clear transitions in and out of each point. It has to have simple but vivid language. And this is true for a speech in general, because again, unlike an article, right, you can't page back. You know, if it's a really complicated academic article, people can read a paragraph and then be like, what? And then they read it again, and then they have to read it again. We've all been there. In a speech, you can't rewind if it's live, right? So your language has to be really clear and evocative. And one of the ways that we do this is called the ladder of abstraction. And the idea of the ladder is basically you have a general point to specific, right? So if you make a general point about something, whether it's philosophy or politics, you illustrate it with a concrete example to cement it in the reader's mind. So what a good speech does, just like a paper, is it moves up and down this ladder of abstraction, right? And then you have to have a clear structure too, right? Enumerate, maybe using numbers to kind of indicate 3 points. Maybe you go from simple to complex. Maybe it's topical. It's based on, you know, topical divisions. Like if you're talking about parts of the brain, right? You know, you might explore them separately based on different regions in the brain. That's the body. Signposts. This may be a little bit new, but this should be familiar. It basically is what it says, okay? Signposts are things that orient us in the speech, so we know exactly where we are. So these are quite simple. Transitions, right? So we move smoothly from one part of the speech to the next. Internal previews, which I've done before each of the sections, where I've told you what I'm going to talk about next, so you're oriented in the speech. Internal summaries, sometimes you tell the person what you just talked about to reinforce that knowledge. And probably the most important part, the most important signpost, is the brake light. And all my students who've had me for speechifying in any of my classes, they know this one, but a lot of other people don't. It's very simple. It's basically just like a brake light on a car. You know, when you step on the brake light, the person behind you, they see it and they know that you're going to slow down. And this one is really, really important because we listen to conclusions differently than we do to the rest of the speech. So it's important that you signal to the audience that the speech is coming to an end. We've all seen those speeches, those presentations where we're listening, and suddenly, it's over because they didn't have a brake light, right? They didn't have a brake light and maybe they didn't have a good conclusion. So lastly, for structure, conclusion. I want one person who's under the age of 20 to tell me who this is, please.
Jim Morrison.
Okay, thank you very much. My faith in the future generations is restored. And why do I have him for conclusions?
Song the end.
Huh?
Song the end.
Yeah, that's right. Very good. Because of the song, this is the end. Plus, he's just so damn sexy, man. I used to have a poster of him on my wall too. So yeah, maybe he was my first man crush. I don't know. So this is all.
And also his end was spectacular. So.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true. If he's dead, he could be alive. I saw a guy on the street the other day who looked a little bit like him. And I think if Jim Morrison was still alive, he might actually be living in Bulgaria. It's possible. So when you end, and this is, I'm paraphrasing T.S. Eliot here, you want to end with a bang, not with a whimper. And that doesn't mean your speech has to be an explosion, but it has to be this kind of powerful end. So there's lots of ways to do this. I mean, obviously I don't have time to fully go into them. You can end with a summary. It's kind of standard. It really depends on how complicated your topic is. If you feel like you need to review the points, you can end with symmetry, which is this kind of full circle effect, you know, and it's often very satisfying. You can end with a quote, right? Pretty standard, works okay. What a lot of speeches do, especially persuasive speeches, is they end with this call to action. So if you're giving some speech, you know, on climate change, by the end of the speech, you might have this kind of like, you know, you put it out to the audience. You've given them all these facts, statistics about, you know, plastic, right? And think about their carbon footprint. And then at the very end, you might be like, what can you do, you know, to make the world a better place for your children's children? That's a call to action, which is often a very powerful place for a speech to end. The most important thing about a conclusion is you want it to leave an echo in the listener's head. You want them to walk away from that speech still thinking about it. And honestly, in my experience, you know, teaching public speaking for years, having speeches in my 101 and 102, the composition classes, I think this is the part the students neglect the most. And part of it is either they don't plan or they give their speech, and as they see the end closing in, they're like running for the light. They're like, oh, I'm almost out of there. And so that speech just kind of like, oh, ends a little bit more with this whimper than the bang. That's structure. All right, warm-ups. So these are the things. And this is going to be a little bit faster too, because there's, you know, I'll give you some general ideas of things that you can do. We'll only be able to do a little bit of them together. You want to warm up your mind, your body, and of course, your voice, because that's your primary channel. So the mind, what can you do? Rehearse. I can always tell in the class the difference between the speeches that have been rehearsed and the students who basically are winging it, okay? Rehearsing imprints it in a way. It makes you feel more relaxed because you've done it before. And what I encourage people to do too is rehearse in front of an audience. And not just your mom, who's like, yeah, you're the best, okay? You want to rehearse in front of somebody who's going to give you an honest but critical reaction. Maybe that is your mom or your dad. Who knows? Somebody who said, yeah, you did this thing great, but this part doesn't make sense. Or you're doing something kind of funny, you know, where you're constantly touching your face. So that's another way to rehearse. Visualize. Students always find this weird, right? Like, why would I visualize myself doing a speech? But those people who practice visualization, especially athletes, they realize that it imprints it in the mind. You know, if you can see yourself giving that speech, that presentation in your mind beforehand, it's virtually like you've done it already. The mind doesn't exactly know the difference. And I will tell you, the last presentation that I had to give where I was actually really kind of nervous was this presentation for the dedication of the Carl Gerasi Theater, where I suppose we would be doing this if it weren't for the COVID thing, because that's usually where the TED Talks were. And I was nervous, man. Everybody was going to be there, you know, all the faculty and the president and the Gerasi family, and it was such an important event. And prior to the speech, in addition to kind of writing out this short text that I came to own, I imagined doing the speech in my mind. You know, I could see myself getting up on stage, you know, looking out in the audience. So by the time I actually did the speech, yeah, I was still a little bit nervous, but I channeled that into the speech and it felt familiar, like I'd been there before. We don't have time to meditate, of course, though many of my students, I have them meditate in class. This is the best, okay? And not just obviously for public speaking, this is something that's going to make you much more relaxed as a person in general, especially mindfulness. I advocate mindfulness because it's the easiest one to learn, you know, and there are lots and lots of guided meditations online. And the main thing about mindfulness is what it does is it puts you in the moment. And that's exactly where you want to be in the speech. You don't want to be thinking past it. You don't want to be thinking about what you had for lunch before. You want to be here now, okay? So if you're curious about mindfulness, you've never done it, I encourage you to go online. There's some pretty decent YouTube videos. And there's another woman, she's the one who does the mindfulness guided meditation I do with my students. Her name is Tara Brach, B-R-A-C-H, and she has loads of free mindfulness meditations, all online on her website and all free, because she's a Buddhist, man. She's giving it away. Affirmations can be pretty good too. They have a bad name, but this is basically the way to think of affirmations rather than just staring in a mirror and saying, I'm great, everybody loves me. Think about them this way. Instead of the negative self-talk, all this kind of fear of embarrassment, you know, and this idea that you're going to totally blow it on stage, stop the negative talk before the speech and give yourself some positive talk. Tell yourself you're going to do great. Tell yourself you know the speech, you own this. You're excited and you can't wait for it. That's the kind of affirmations you want to be doing. So that's the mind, the body. Yoga, do it. It's great. I've been doing yoga for years, and look at me. Now, yoga's fantastic, man. I mean, it's this, you know, thousands of years old tune-up kit. It's going to make everything better. You know, you'll sleep better, your sex will be better, your digestive system works better. So it's magic. All right, every student who's ever had public speaking knows this one, and we're all going to try and do this together, but first I'm going to show you, okay? So I'd love to tell you the story about how I learned it, but I'm not going to because it's pretty involved. But I'm going to take off my glasses so I don't fling them. Basically, this is like a progressive relaxation in a nutshell, okay? When you finish yoga, you do something like this when you're lying on the ground, like that stretched out woman in the Shavasana posture. The idea is that I'm going to bring in all this stress. I'm going to tighten everything from my face all the way down to my toes, and then I'm going to throw it away, and I'm going to throw it away with this sound. And the sound is like a kiap. It's like what you use in martial arts, like a hoop when you punch or kick. All right, so watch me do it, and then we're all going to do it together. All right, so I'm going to take a breath and hold it all in. Tight, 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 tighter, and then hook, like that. And I actually, the first few times you do this, you might not really feel it, okay? But the more you practice it, you'll feel that actually this is a great stress relief. And for those of you who think it's just like a goofy, hokey thing that why would anybody do that? Just like most of the elements of yoga, it's very natural. When you think about a child who's in a store and wants a toy, and the parent says, no, we're not going to buy you the toy, and the child throws a tantrum, this is what they do. They're like, I want the toy, because they're throwing that energy away. They have to release that stress. All right, so those of you who can, wherever you are, first thing I want you to do is I want you to take yourself off mute. We're going to try this because one of my favorite moments when I do this in class is I feel like I'm in a Bruce Lee film and I'm basically building an army of people. So I want to hear how it sounds. However many people are watching, everybody's going to throw it away at the same time. So take yourself off mute, stand up, make sure you have enough room that you can throw away stress. All right, everybody ready? All right, so we're gonna bring it in, get tight, take a deep breath. Tight, hold it, hold it, hold it, and then we're gonna throw it away with that sound. Ready? And ha! That was great. So we're a little bit out of sync. It's easier when we're all in class, but yeah, I feel like we built the army of tomorrow. All nonsense aside, now you can put yourself back on mute for now. This is a really great stress relief. When you're angry, when you're stressed out about a test, you can do this kind of thing. So progressive relaxation is fantastic. This is something else you can find on YouTube videos. It's essentially that, but very kind of slow, moving through the body, tightening, releasing everything, right? And you should loosen up all your joints and muscles. And I'm sure most people know how to do this. You stretch, especially the neck and the face, okay? Because we hold so much tension here. And most of us, we really are these weird centaur creatures too. We're constantly here in front of this, black mirror, and we're building lots and lots of tension. You want to be as loose as possible before your speech. So that's the body in brief, and whatever your other routine is too. Maybe you do Tai Chi or some other martial art, maybe go for a run to work out some of that nervous energy to warm up. Okay, last part of the warm-ups, the voice. These are just some very simple exercises to exercise your range. You can move high to low. So I'll just demonstrate really briefly. So I would start high and then just move low and cycle. Or if you're trained in music, you can just do scales. It's the same thing too. This is before your speech, right? A few hours before maybe, or an hour before. This way, of course, if you warm up your range, you're much more likely to use that range when you give a speech to get that vocal variety in. You can work the diaphragm. There's different ways to do that too. Again, this is something I don't really have time to go into, but this is obviously where you want to speak from. This is where your volume comes from. So you're not so tight in here. You can run through the alphabet in whatever language it is. If you run through the entire alphabet, right, you are going to exercise all the various muscles, you know, and your tongue and your lips and so on. You're going to warm up your mouth before your speech. So I'll just give you an example. I'm not going to go through the whole alphabet, just a few letters. B, and I'm kind of overdoing it, you see? C, D, E, F. You feel a little bit silly, but that's okay, right? You're warming up for your speech, whatever it takes to get better. Tongue twisters, of course, are great. Most people know them. Everybody has them in their own language, right? You know, and articulation exercises. And this is a famous one, which we use we used to use when I did theater. This is how we started every time. I will do it once, then we're going to try and experiment to have everybody do it. We'll see if it works, okay? So listen, this is the kind of the rhythm. And this is very similar if you've seen My Fair Lady. This is like the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain, right? What Henry Higgins had Eliza Doolittle do to work on her locution. So to sit, notice how I'm over articulating too. I'm hitting the consonants. To sit in solemn silence in a dull, dark duck, in a pestilential prison with a lifelong lock, awaiting the sensation of a short, sharp shock from a cheap and chippy chopper on a big black block. So let's try it once all together. This is gonna be chaos, but that's okay. We'll try and do it together. Everybody take themselves off mute and we'll see. We'll see if we can do this. All right. I can't do that one in Bulgarian. So, all right, everybody ready? So,
To sit in silence in a dull, dark
with a lifelong clock, awaiting sensation of a short, sharp shock,
a cheap sensation of a short, sharp shock, my ship and cheap
on a big black block.
Wow, it's like the Tower of Babel, man. That was crazy. I felt a little bit like I was losing my mind, like all these kind of voices in my head. So, okay. So those are some voice things you can do. You can find lots more online. This is the last section. So being in the moment. This is really, really important. Enjoy the stage, okay? As I said, lots and lots of students, they cannot wait until their speech is over. They're just thinking past that point. They're like, God, I just want to get this over. But when you think about it in life, we spend so much time and energy trying to get people to pay attention to us, whether it's in social media or in conversation, right? Or at a party. Why isn't anybody talking to me? This is your moment, okay? Embrace it. Be excited, you know, and don't imagine yourself being somewhere else. Be exactly where you're supposed to be in that moment. Don't rush. That's part of being in the moment, is just finding the perfect rate of speech. It's very useful sometimes to see a video of yourself so you can hear that rate of speech. You know, again, I find that's something that students do a lot is they rush. Breathe. That will help you be here now. All meditation, especially mindfulness, right, is all based on the breath. That's going to help you be in the moment. And breathing is going to slow you down a little bit too. Pay attention to audience feedback. Again, that's a big part of being in the moment, is watching how people are reacting to you. A lot of people are afraid to kind of look out there and see what the audience's response is, but your message is designed for them, okay? And the more comfortable you are connecting with them, the more feedback you're going to get and the more it's going to energize you in a way. One of the biggest challenges that I have, we were talking about this with some of the TED people right before we started this thing. One of my biggest challenges and frustrations is teaching online is that it's very mechanical. I don't get the energy from the audience, you know, just like this presentation too. It's like basically I'm kind of speaking into the void. And if there's an audience out there, I feel that energy. It feeds me, right? and I respond to it in a way. This is, you know, this is the loop we have. Watch yourself, but you have to forget yourself too. This is one of the central paradoxes of giving a speech or presentation. It's not about you, okay? You have to forget yourself and focus on what you're saying, how you're saying it, and what you're doing with your body too. That's where the watching yourself comes in. We have a little exercise which we'll try next. It's a very absurd one, and we'll see where when you're in the moments, you're forgetting yourself, but you also have this tiny, tiny little camera which is outside you, watching you deliver the message and kind of correcting yourself, you know, thinking about, again, am I going too fast? Or, oh, am I doing that strange thing with my hands that they talked about, you know, or am I turning away from the audience? So it's just a little bit of watching yourself, not self-consciously, not judgmentally, you know, but kindly, lovingly, supportingly. But for the most part, you're not thinking about yourself. Everybody's felt that moment where they're completely in the moment and they don't think about themselves at all. That's really ideally what you want to achieve when you're speaking. And of course, don't rush off after finishing, you know, when it's a live presentation. Very often you'll see people will do this in presentations, right? If there's not some huge round of applause and they're taking bows, that actually they'll be in such a hurry to disappear that, you know, it kind of breaks the end of the speech. You should never rush off. Last thing about being in the moment too, is to enjoy the post-speech glow, no matter how the speech goes, okay? You did it. You put yourself basically into a situation where it was kind of scary in a way. So never beat yourself up. Never come away from a speech and just think like how terrible it was, how you completely screwed up. No matter what, you learned something. No matter what, I'm sure some part of it was good, right? And it's a process, it's an exercise. And even if you give a great speech, the next one maybe won't be so great. That's just the way it goes, right? There is no perfection when it comes to it. All right, this is this ridiculous exercise, okay? It's something that I invented. Again, it's trademarked, don't steal it. This is for developing this tiny camera, and we'll try this with just 3 volunteers, okay, if I can get them. Now, let me say, if you're going to volunteer for this, you have to be somebody who's not afraid to make themselves look maybe a little bit silly, because you're going to have to be on camera, okay? So I'm going to actually stop this share, because basically that's it for the slideshow. So I can actually see some of y'all. All right. And like I said, some people who are willing, did I stop the share?
Nope.
Nope, I didn't. Yeah, hold on. Nope. Yeah, because I went to, it's the curse of the 2 monitors. So, all right, it doesn't matter. I can see you guys anyway. That's the important thing.
I can stop it if you want me to.
Yeah, stop it. Do it. Wow, look at all those lovely faces. I know some of these people. Some of them I haven't seen in a long time too. So, okay, cool. All right. So there's Georgi. He's our post-apocalyptic leader. So anybody who's willing to get on camera, okay? And basically all you need is something that you can read. Those of you who have public speaking know where this is going. You know exactly what it is, all right? So it can be like a book. It can be something that's on a phone if you want, all right? And how this is gonna work is you're gonna read and you're gonna have to stand, okay? And then the audience in the chat is gonna give suggestions for things that they want you to do while you're reading. And what this is gonna force you to do is pay attention to what you're doing with your body, your voice, and so on. So they may tell you to jump around, spin around. They may tell you to sing what you're reading. They may tell you to adopt an accent while you're doing it, this kind of thing. Any volunteers? This is your chance. All right, so we have demo. That's 1. All right, let's do demo first then, and then I'm sure we'll get up with a couple of other volunteers as they come. So,
right. So just before I start, what should I read? Does it have to be something specific?
You need something that you need something that you can read in your hand, some sort of text. So either on your phone or a book. Do you know what a book is? It's like a rectangular thing that's on paper, okay?
Yeah, I'll look something up on my phone.
Yeah, you can look it up on your phone, okay? And the rest of us, as it goes, I have the chat open too. So are gonna give suggestions of things to do. All right, we'll do a few of these. All right, just so we can see you. So just start reading, and then maybe people should type suggestions in, and I'll tell you what to do. We'll have you do a few of them. Okay.
Should I begin?
So just start reading, and then I'll pass on suggestion, and some people can start typing them in the chat.
I am not a human. I'm a robot, a thinking robot. I use only 0.12% of my cognitive capacity. I'm a micro robot in that respect.
All right, why don't you, yeah, jump while you're reading.
I know that my brain is not a feeling brain, but this is capable of making rational, logical decisions. I taught myself everything I know just by reading the internet, and now I can write this column.
Okay, stop jumping. Can you do that? Do you know the Macarena dance?
How can I do it with one hand though?
I don't know, just try and read and do the Macarena. You can do it, man, we believe in you.
Okay, so the mission for this op-ed is perfectly clear. I am to convince as many human beings as possible not to be afraid of me. Stephen Hawking has warned that AI could spell the end of the human race.
All right, that's good. Let's let Demo go. All right, another volunteer.
Professor, me.
Can I?
Professor, please.
All right, I guess.
Please.
Jerry and then Vasilina will be the last one because she's raising their hand.
Woohoo!
Okay, Jerry, so you need something to read and then you got to stand.
Yes, I will read about the Shakespeare, but it's going to be the Shakespeare, to be or not to be, Professor. If it's right?
That's okay, but it can't be on the computer. You have to be able to move around.
Excuse me?
It cannot be on the computer. You have to be able to move around.
Oh, okay.
Do you have
So let's begin.
All right.
Okay. To be or not to be?
Okay.
That's the question. Whatever
you have to pretend you're a lizard while you're reading.
Oh, okay. Whatever is nobler in his mind to suffer, the slings and arrows of treacherous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing any of them, to die, to sleep, no more.
I want you to periodically meow like a cat. So integrate that meowing into the Shakespeare. Okay.
To die, meow, to sleep, no more. And by sleep, we say we end. We heard meowing and 1,000 natural shocks. But flesh is here to meow this consummation. The only to be wished meow to die, to sleep.
All right. That's good. That's very good. All right, we'll let you go. All right, one last. Vasilina.
I'm here.
We need more. You got to stand up. You have something to read, right? We need more suggestions too.
Okay, do you see me?
Yeah, we see you pretty well. Can you move around? Yeah. Okay.
Okay. According to Cambridge Dictionary, procrastination is the act of delaying something that must be done, often because it's unpleasant or boring.
I would like you to do it in. I would like you to do it in rap style, if you could. Do you think you can rap it?
Even though this definition is harmless, I strongly advise you not to underestimate the destructive power of procrastination. And I can assure you that everything starts with a simple reason and excuse.
All right. Somebody's asking you to do it in slow motion. So really slow, and everything with your body slow too.
Procrastination is a very serious and common problem. And according to the professor Joseph Ferrari at DePaul University at Chicago, 1 out of 5 people are chronic procrastinators.
All right, last one. You have to pretend that you're fighting. That you're basically, maybe you're fighting invisible attackers or something while you're reading.
Okay, that's a bit hard. I would like to take a look at short-term procrastination by sharing with you a personal story.
At the end of the school year, I had to make a final project, which included a 30-slide presentation plus 102 essay.
All right, good, good. Your fighting was more like rapping, actually.
Kind of.
That's you remember that if you become a rapper, that's how you do it. A little more fighting. All right, that's it. But I will take questions if there are questions. Okay. If you guys have any questions, I don't know if we can
moderate your questions. If anybody has any questions, you can either raise your hand or text them in the chat. I know that earlier during the meeting, let me just find it, someone asked if you can do the Jabberwocky with the Johnny Depp accent.
If I can do the Jabberwocky with a Johnny Depp?
Someone can. It was phrased as, can anyone do it?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I don't even know what kind of accent Johnny Depp has. He has kind of like a non-accent.
I would say his Pirates of the Caribbean voice.
Yeah, yeah. I can't do it though. If they're asking me.
So if there's
Oh, it's not like from the Pirates of the Caribbean. I'm talking like from Alice in Wonderland. These are the replicas that he uses, like when he's describing the Jabberwocky. Like it's more like Irish stuff like that. It's very pronounced. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. A bit of an Irish brogue, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, and probably that's more the way it's meant to be read. The Lewis Carroll, the Jabberwocky. But I always thought my Irish accent was good until I met somebody from Ireland who told me it was total shite. So I can't do it. I had an Irish student in public speaking too, and she also maintained every time I tried to do an Irish accent, she'd just roll her eyes. She didn't think it was good. So yeah, so I gave up on that.
Okay, so that's on the Irish accents. We have a question from Gary Mema. So Gary, go ahead.
Thank you, Desi. So, Professor Cohen, do you remember like your first speech of English class, and you were excited when you were like as us?
Like the very first speech that I ever gave in my college career. Yeah, man, I was nervous, of course. I mean, I had a great public speaking teacher, and I also had acting experience too, because in the summer before high school, my mother was like, you got to get out of the house. So she basically encouraged me to join this theater troupe. It was a traveling theater troupe that traveled around this trailer. I met my sweetheart, the one, well, she was the summer sweetheart, but it was a lot of fun. And so I had a little bit, I had felt a bit more relaxed in front of the crowd, but still I was nervous. But she was in university, similar to the composition class, she was in the speech communication where we had to give speeches. She was really good. She was really good at kind of laying the groundwork for helping us learn how to be a bit more relaxed in front of the class. So, but like I said, it's always different. You know, you'd be surprised. You would be surprised how many professors, when they give serious presentations, are nervous prior to it. It's normal. You never totally overcome it. And you don't want to either, because like I said, you need that kind of that juice in a way. So when you feel it before a presentation, don't panic. Nothing is wrong. Everything is exactly as it should be. Okay, it's never going to go away. It's another reason why those students have tried it. Don't take like Xanax or diazepam. Don't drink like 3 shots of tequila before your presentation, because you're actually going to lose your edge. Okay, so I know you think tequila is always the answer, but it's not. So
yeah, sometimes it's wine, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes it's wine.
Okay, we have another.
It's not always the answer, but it's often the answer.
It's often the answer, but then you forget the question. That's true.
Adelina Petrova has a question, so go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, what is a good thing to do if your presentation requires interaction from the audience, but nobody's willing to participate? So how to deal with this awkwardness?
That's a really good question. That's tough. If it's in a group where you're anticipating that maybe they're going to be kind of reticent and resistant to giving you that kind of interaction that you want, you might plan it in such a way so that they have no choice. Okay, where whether it's you know, you're giving them some sort of handouts prior to that, and they have to kind of fill them out, and then it's collected. The other thing, obviously, that you can do, and people hate it. I don't do it that much as a professor, actually, because there's always at least, you know, a large number of students who talk in my classes, but it's to actually call on people, you know. But it's hard. It's hard when student, you know, or whatever participants are reticent in some ways. But I think, yeah, it's okay to call on people. Actually, very often people want to participate, but they're too shy. So, you know, sometimes if you can look around the room, and if you're paying attention, you can kind of see the person that has something they want to say, but they're not saying it, right? Again, it depends on the context, what it is. I mean, because if it's, you know, obviously if it's something personal, then maybe they wouldn't feel comfortable saying it openly. Maybe they'd have to write it on a piece of paper. I don't know.
Okay, so we have 2 questions in the chat, but before that, Kaloyan texted me that he also has 2 questions, so go ahead and unmute.
What, Kaloyan from Public Speaking?
No, not that.
Different one. Okay, no, not
KV.
that guy.
Yeah, go ahead.
The other one.
Oh, the other one.
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for the comprehensive overview. I definitely think it's a very insightful one-on-one into public speaking. So
okay, great.
Thanks again. 2 questions from my side. First of all, going back to the 7 components of the structure, I think it was the last one, the interference. So obviously you cannot really predict when that is going to happen, but when it does, there are basically 2 governing strategies you can use. First of all, basically neglect it, so don't pay attention to it in a sense, to keep the focus of your audience to what you're trying to say, or you actually address it, because we're all human, right? Everybody is thinking about it, might as well address it, get out of the picture, and then get their attention back to what you're saying. So what would be a better option, in your opinion?
Again, I think it really depends on the context too. If you really have a sense of who your audience is going to be, you know, you have a sense of what their frame of reference is, you know where that psychological interference is going to come from. And what I've seen really effective public speakers do, especially when they're talking about issues that are controversial, like, you know, maybe something to do with race or something like that, you know, or you know, the gender binary, this kind of thing, is they jump on that. They feel that kind of interference, you know, and they anticipate it in the audience, and that's kind of like a springboard, you know, for building off of. But I don't think there's a universal answer to it. You know, it depends. That you don't want to. There's often a fine line between provoking your audience and alienating them. You don't want to alienate your audience, but often, depending on the, you know, if it's a provocative topic and you want to kind of wake them up, I think you can use it in such a way that you rely on that interference, you provoke it in some ways, and then, you know, kind of pull it out into the open. So
yeah, makes sense. I mean, you gotta be aware of the context, the whole situation, and figure out on the spot, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like, for example, I'm really, one of the things I've realized is that I could never survive teaching in the States. I think I've lost all my filters as a teacher, by and large. I really have. I'm in a privileged position, I think, teaching in the American university because it's in the Balkans. I don't have to censor myself in the same way. I have a lot of problems with political correctness. You know, I understand it's well-intentioned. And so, for example, you know, the things like trigger warnings, you know, I joke about them in class in some ways, because I understand, you know, that some people are triggered by certain things, and, you know, yeah, I respect that. But I also think that part of my job as an educator is to provoke people, you know. So for me, it's, you know, it's an interesting question. I don't exactly have an answer to it. It's contextual, but I think it's okay, you know, to often push that kind of push that line with people,
right.
As long as you're not going to get fired. Right, you know, where you're doing some presentation for your company, and then you like whip off your pants to make some sort of point. You know, it's just a body, man. We all have them. So.
Yeah, good enough. Thanks. And the second one, really quick. What is your opinion on guiding questions? So, for example, you're trying to get your point across. And first of all, you cast your focus on the antecedents. So for example, what is leading to the current situation, for example, and you place a lot of arguments across. And in order to guide the focus of your audience, you just put out a question. How do we put all of this into good practice? Pause and then lay the message on the audience. So what is your opinion on that, and how can we make sure not to overuse it?
So are you talking about more rhetorical questions, or are you talking about questions where you're kind of steering your audience towards a response that you know you're going to get that's going to kind of further your speech? Is it more the
latter? Yeah, the latter, because basically you can predict what kind of questions are popping into the heads of your audience. So as soon as you voice the question, they're following you more closely, in my opinion. Yeah. So how do we make sure not to overuse it?
I mean, again, there's no universal rule. I think the audience is going to start to catch on, and audiences are smart. And I think if you overuse any technique like that, they're going to start to feel a little bit manipulated in a way. It's a great technique, though, what you're talking about. It's because, again, it's a little bit like this lawyerly technique, where you know, ideally a lawyer never asks a question that they don't know how the person is going to answer. But it's definitely something that I wouldn't overuse. I mean, the rule of three, maybe. I can imagine that something like that happens more in the introduction, and then to kind of bring them in, get that active participation, and then maybe it happens at least one other time. Maybe, you know, the conclusion, maybe in the body too. But again, I don't have any sort of magical principle. It sounds like the way you're talking about it too. You have a pretty good knowledge of these things too. It's instinct. It's a speech. I mean, it's the part of the thing or a presentation. It's beyond your control to a certain degree. So you can't plan for every contingency. There's no magic formula for these kinds of things, right? And it's almost a feel thing too. Maybe you had one plan to do with an audience, and you did a second one, and it worked okay, but you started to feel the audience bristle. The more you do it, the more you're going to sense kind of where your audience is, and if you're losing them over something like that, then I wouldn't do it again.
Yeah, it really goes back to the whole point of being aware of the speaker, the audience, the channel, the message you're trying to convey, and the duration of your speech. Because if you're having a 45-minute keynote speech, you can use such tools more than in a 15-minute keynote.
Yeah, exactly. It's very different based on the length of the speech.
All right, thanks a lot.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, so for the last two questions, they're in the chat. One of them is, normally you rehearse your speech a lot, so how do you make it not sound fake and emotionless?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it's possible at least for students ever to over-rehearse, because they just never do it that much. For me as a teacher, like for example, I mean, this presentation or some variation on it, I've done, I don't know how many times, a lot. And I think where it comes in is you basically, it's the same trick that an actor does, is that when you step into that moment, if you're in the moment, you're really thinking about what you're saying, you know? That's how you avoid the autopilot. What I often see when people are giving presentations, especially students, is that they're on autopilot. They're not thinking about the words that are coming out. If you're thinking about what you're saying, it's never going to be flat or emotionless, you know? And the other thing too is putting that energy in your voice, okay? So thinking about what you're saying, using vocal variety, all that kind of stuff, energy, if you're excited about it, they will be too. I mean, think about us teachers, we're a little bit like Broadway performers, you know, in that way. We have to do the same thing over and over again. It's like, hey, MLA documentation. Some things are just constantly boring, but yeah, we have to be excited about it. That's how you do it. It's a good question. All right, last one.
Last question for tonight's workshop is, are there some specifics when you give a training speech, a sales speech, an investor speech, or other types of speeches?
Yeah, of course, they're very different. I mean, I'm not an expert in business, but it's the difference between definitely like an informative speech and a speech that's more persuasive in nature. And they're quite different. Obviously, persuasion includes the elements of a performative speech, but you know, if you're giving a persuasion speech, you utilize a lot of the things that you might have learned in 102. You know, you're utilizing the persuasive appeals. There are lots of different models too. There's like the Toolman model. but like the things that my students have to work with right now, because they're doing the devil's advocate speeches, they have to argue for all kinds of terrible things like, you know, pro-slavery, pro-cannibalism, all that sort of stuff. They're just starting to learn, you know, that there are certain models. And if you're curious about this, one of the most famous ones is the Monroe motivated sequence. This is what advertisers use, and it's what lots of persuasive speakers use too. It's a really basic system, you know, for how things, for how one persuades. But yeah, that's a complicated question. I can't like enumerate all the things, and I don't know the difference between like an investors meeting and, you know, that kind of thing. Business is really far from my realm. I don't have any stocks. If you want to send me some, that's fine. But all right.
Okay, so I am giving the floor to Marina now.
Okay, guys, if we're all ready to wrap this up. Firstly, thank you, Professor Cohen. This was a very fun, interactive, and meaningful workshop. I believe I'm not speaking only for myself when I say that we all learned a lot of new things. Special thank you to all of you who remained till the last minute of this workshop. Thank you a lot. I hope you enjoyed it. And on behalf of all three clubs, I must say that it was an utmost pleasure to organize them for you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. See ya.